Is the government of Eritrea an anti-democratic dictatorship? Does a recent UN-backed report make a legitimate case for referring Eritrean government officials to the International Criminal Court? Do national service programs extended indefinitely constitute a form of slavery? Is the Eritrean government justified in locking up individuals identified as journalists and turning away religious and other institutions? Is there a geopolitical and geostrategic context that justifies the actions of the Eritrean government? This week on the Global Research News Hour, we put the spotlight on Eritrea and speak with two observers with two opposing perspectives on whether or not the country is flouting the rule of law. We'll hear from government critic Andebrehan Wilde-Georges, who has served in government and is a veteran of Eritrean's War of Independence. And we'll also hear from independent Asmara-based journalist Thomas C. Mountain, who is a defender of the government. On this week's program, Africa's Cuba? What is behind international condemnation of Eritrea? Bringing you the analysis beyond the media headlines, the Global Research News Hour is on the air. The African nation of Eritrea established its independence from Ethiopia in 1993 following a 30-year war and a UN-supervised referendum. The country is a one-party state governed by the People's Front for Democracy and Justice under the leadership of Isaias Afwerki. In June of 2016, a three-person UN-backed commission submitted a report alleging that representatives of the Eritrean government had committed human rights violations over the course of 2 decades, which amounted to crimes against humanity. The accusations include slavery, forced disappearances, torture, and indefinite imprisonment without trial. The authors had hoped to have the report submitted to the UN Security Council in order to have Eritrean officials referred to the International Criminal Court. However, the report has been criticized for allowing anonymous testimony and for lacking corroborating data or hard evidence. This week on the Global Research News Hour, we delve into the question of Eritrea's human rights record and examine whether there might be ulterior motives on the part of the major Western powers for wanting to embellish the human rights crimes of this African nation. We start with a conversation with a distinguished Eritrean national and author who had visited the University of Winnipeg in September of 2016 as part of a speaking tour. Ambassador Andebrehan Wilde-Georges is a veteran of the War for Eritrea's Liberation and a founding member of the Central Committee of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front and the People's Front for Democracy and Justice. He has served as president of the University of Asmara, Governor of the Bank of Eritrea, member of the Eritrean National Assembly. He is currently a senior mediation specialist and political dialogue facilitator at the European Center for Electoral Support. He is the author of the 2014 book Eritrea at a Crossroads, a narrative of triumph, betrayal, and hope by Strategic Book Publishing and Rights Company. Mr. Andebrehan Wilde-Georges speaks in this clip recorded at the University of Winnipeg about the extended national service program as amounting to slavery. He then explains his position in a conversation recorded at CKUW on September 26, 2016.
Particularly after the border war with Ethiopia, the national service, which was initially designed for 18 months, 6 months of military training and 12 months for national service in the different departments, in the different public work programs, road construction, building hospitals, clinics, schools, etc. It turned out to be indefinite, endless. Once in, you're not out. People were 18, 19, 20 when they volunteered. In 1994, since 1994 now, how many years? They are in their late 30s, 40s, early 40s. What does it mean? They have been denied proper upbringing. They have been denied proper education. They have been denied the opportunity to develop their capacity and to earn a living. When people develop skills, when people develop expertise, not only do they provide for their own families and themselves, but they contribute to the development of the country. The initial program is military service, but in reality, many conscripts also serve in the ministries, in public works, etc., etc. But much of that is done without proper study, without proper environmental assessment studies.
So people are maybe putting themselves in danger, or?
Not so much in danger. It's actually the deprivation of freedom of choice, the deprivation of the opportunity to learn and prepare for a future. Essentially, they are being robbed of their future, whether they are directly in active military service or in the civilian or quasi-civilian departments of the regime. The crux of the matter is that this is forcible, uncompensated, and indefinite.
There are other countries, like even in the United States, remember in the Vietnam War most famously, where soldiers were actually conscripted to service in times of war. But you see this as being specifically different here, that because that is what we're talking about, conscription. And I don't think I've ever heard conscription being equated with slavery.
Well, it's the particular circumstances that make it. As its inception, it was really, in my view, a legitimate program. Every country has a right to build a capacity for self-defense, not necessarily to commit aggression, but serve as deterrents to potential aggressors or against potential aggressors. And so when it was proclaimed in 1994, we had two situations. In the first place, the end of the War of National Liberation, which lasted for 30 years, as I said earlier, found us with a liberation army of about 100,000 men and women. And it was not sustainable for a small country like Eritrea, with an underdeveloped economy, to maintain such an army. More importantly, it was not necessary to maintain such an army. Of course, Eritrea finds itself in a strategic but highly volatile region, the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea Basin, and of course the adjacent Arabian Peninsula. And this has been, of course, in perennial crisis. And therefore, Eritrea needed to have a credible defense capability, and that was the purpose for the inception of national service. But it's also very clear that it had limits. The fact that it's indefinite. Otherwise, the idea was to demobilize this 100,000 Liberation Army, build a small, well-equipped, modern ground forces, the Army, similarly an Air Force, similarly a Navy. A very small, affordable force in each category of the armed forces for Eritrea. And the national service was meant to provide a reserve army or a people's army that could be mobilized in short notice whenever necessary, whenever there's a danger of aggression. That was the purpose. Now, when there is no active war, it is very difficult to justify it. And in fact, it's condemnable, because essentially what it does is not only forces these people to remain there indefinitely, but they're not compensated at all. That deprives them the opportunity to build and sustain families. And it also targets the family, because when everyone able-bodied, because the economy of Eritrea is basically a rural economy based on agriculture and animal husbandry, 80% of the population, where the helping hands of every family member are very important. The national service comprising the ages of 18 to 50 is the most productive part of any country's labor force. And when they are engaged in economically non-productive activities, the economy essentially suffers. And when it's a rural-based agrarian economy, the impact is that much more. So the cost is not only to the individuals, but to their families and to the country as a whole. So whereas a country can use conscription legitimately when the requirements of national defense make it necessary, in this case, in a situation of no war, no peace, then to maintain that is wrong.
I think that a point could possibly be made in the sense that Eritrea is located right next to this very, aggressive military government in Ethiopia. There have been some border skirmishes there, as I understand it. And at the same time, you've got these larger powers, the United States and China and Russia, that all have their own objectives, and these could impose potentially a lot of serious restrictions on a very tiny country. I mean, 6 million people. So I'm wondering if there isn't possibly a justification in the sense that you've got. Just like Washington, for example, they seem to be very closely allied with Ethiopia, whereas the Eritrean government is very openly trying to block U.S. interests and or hegemonic interests, or so the argument goes. I've heard Eritrea being kind of referred to or compared with Cuba in that sense, that you're dealing with economic sanctions and you're dealing, like I say, with Ethiopia right next door. So I'm wondering if that doesn't justify in some sense some of the extended national service or other provisions that put them perhaps in a state of a extended I call it a Cold War. Or
you are right. The region is crisis riven, volatile, and now we have fires all over around Eritrea. You have Yemen up in flames. You have Sudan with its perennial problems in Darfur, southern Kordofan, Blue Nile, the Nuba Mountains. You have South Sudan exploding in civil war. You have Ethiopia, where you have these mass protests, uprisings. We don't know where they will end. You have Somalia, 25 years of really statelessness, essentially, stateless anarchy. You have tiny Djibouti. Then you have Eritrea. So this is a very volatile and crisis-ridden region. So it's quite legitimate for any country, particularly Eritrea, to have a program of national service that should be implemented within the frameworks or the parameters of the proclamation in a legal sense. National security is not predicated on the size of your army alone. You need logistics, you need to build your economy, you need to develop your society. Warfare today is not just manpower and arms. It's sophisticated. You need sophisticated intelligence gathering mechanism, radar system, air defense, modern artillery, tanks, all of that, okay? But it's not these weapons which fight. It's the men and women who operate these weapons who are convinced of the justice of their cause, in this case national defense, and are willing to die for that. The impact of national service has been to deplete the country of its youth, with Eritrea providing the second largest refugee population to Europe and the Middle East after Syria, where obviously, of course, there is a crisis in Syria, the civil war everywhere, the rise of the Islamic State, etc., etc. So yes, but this one-dimensional focus is not really serving the national interest or defending the country. Ethiopia continues to occupy sovereign Eritrean territory. So this huge army that is made up of national service recruits has not managed to defend the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Eritrea. Worse still, the Ethiopian army makes occasional forays beyond the areas it controls into other parts of Eritrea, and the response of the government has been very weak. And so national service is really a pretext to militarize the society, to regimentalize the youth, so that the spearhead of all protest and resistance to injustice, they can be neutralized. So national service is not really, in the Eritrean context, is not an instrument of national security, of national defense, but an instrument of regime security, an instrument for prolonging the regime of a dictatorship that the Eritrean government has become.
I know that in the case of Libya and currently Syria, there is this sense that humanitarian concern and human rights is used as a pretext for larger hegemonic goals, be it Washington or other major powers, France, what have you. So I don't know. Is there a concern here that however legitimate the human rights crisis might be in Eritrea, that it will be folded into some kind of a military intervention somewhere down the line, as we saw with Libya, that could actually serve to basically devastate the country? Regime change, but justified using humanitarian intervention as a pretext. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, the whole edifice of intervention in the Middle East, spearheaded by the Bush administration in the United States and the Blair administration in the United Kingdom, was based on fabricated facts. There were neither weapons of mass destruction nor any links of the regime with Al-Qaeda. And therefore, the whole justification for the war in Iraq was based on essentially lies, if I may say so, fabricated facts. And he hit the nail in the head when he said this hegemonic. And the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the dismantling of the Iraqi army is directly linked to the rise of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So the root cause of all that is this external intervention. And then in Libya, the same. We in Eritrea are firmly opposed to any external intervention. In fact, my personal view is that the legitimate form for the trial of alleged crimes committed in Eritrea would be Eritrea itself, not the ICC. As he implied, it's selective prosecution, ignoring people who've committed enormous crimes, whose acts have been the cause of millions of lives lost, displaced, are not even accused. They are not pursued. It's the little guys. And what essentially, even among the little guys, the ICC actually goes after the vanquished, not after the victor. And so selective justice to me is injustice. A capacity to treat similar situations similarly, I think, gives a sort of balance to any justice system. It's for this reason that the AU and the most African states are thinking of withdrawing from the ICC. So in terms of the Eritrean case, In the first place, it's not really a foregone conclusion that a resolution would pass in the United Nations Security Council. You know how the Security Council operates. It's essentially the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, which run the show. And anyone can block anything, depending on where is national interest. There's no principle, there's no justice in international relations. International relation is for the struggle for power, for domination, of national domination. So each is seeking its national interest, often camouflaged in terms of justice, in terms of human rights, in terms of that. Look, human rights, what's happening in Yemen now. This mass bombardment of civilian targets, including hospitals, including civilian residence areas. And who's orchestrating that? Who is behind all that? So in Eritrea has always been, of course, neglected by the international community. For 30 years, the Eritrean people fought alone. And the United Nations, which in the first place imposed the federal arrangement with Ethiopia, had committed to remain seized of the matter in the event that the federal arrangement was violated. For 30 years, it raised no voice at all, even the AU. So in Eritrea, our experience convinces us that we must be in the driver's seat ourselves. Change is our business. Administration of justice against the aggrieved members of our society is our business. We may need maybe international support on our terms to strengthen our capacity to do what we want. Otherwise, would be opposed to any attempt to intervene in Eritrea or Eritrean affairs under any pretext, because our experience and the experience of the neighborhood that we were talking about, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, closer to home, all of that demonstrates that camouflage in terms of humanitarian protection, in terms of this, that, is always the national interest, that the driving force of foreign military intervention.
Okay. Dr. Ande Berhan Wilde Georges, I want to thank you very much for sharing these thoughts with us and these very important perspectives. And I want to wish you all the best and as you continue your journey across Canada.
Thank you very much for having me. And we hope we'll see each other again.
Dr. Ande Berhan Wilde Georges, he is currently the Senior Mediation Specialist and Political Dialogue Facilitator at the European Centre for Electoral Support. And his book is Eritrea at a Crossroads, a narrative of triumph, betrayal, and hope.